right, guys, so in our last section notes, we talked a great deal about the factors that led to imperialism, or the reasons in which we decided to imperialize. There were four main ones. They were for economic reasons, military reasons, because of nationalism, and then also humanitarian factors. We also talked about some of the arguments for U.S. expansion. So those, again, were economic growth, protecting American security, preserving American spirit, and, ultimately, Americans did lean towards imperialism. However, because we are moving into other people's land, trying to take it over, trying to control it, it's going to lead to conflicts. It's going to lead to wars. And one example of that would be here, the Spanish-American War. And so in this section, we're going to talk a great deal about the details of the Spanish-American War and how it came about. So this war was in 1898. We go to war to help Cuba win its independence from Spain. All right, so setting the stage for war. By demanding that a boundary dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain be sent to arbitration, the United States defended the fidelity of the Monroe Doctrine. So in this case, arbitration is just the settlement of a dispute by a person or panel chosen to listen to both sides and then hopefully reach some sort of decision. So basically here, what ends up happening is Venezuela and Great Britain cannot decide on or agree on a boundary line. So we kind of jump in and we try to be the mediator between these two groups. What ends up happening is the British government backed down, mostly because they needed to stay friendly with us, because Germany was gaining more and more power within Africa, and they needed us on their side. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was when we warned European nations of further colonization. We did not agree with some of the reasons in which other countries, European countries, were taking over land and controlling areas, or the way in which they were going about doing that. All right, so the United States became involved in the Cuban Rebellion against Spain to protect American business interests. So basically, we had businesses in Cuba, and so when Spain tries to take over the area, we are not okay with that because that could lead to Spain interfering with our businesses or our profits decreasing or shutting down altogether. So in competition for readership, two New York newspapers wrote exaggerated stories about the Cuban Rebellion. This yellow journalism sold a lot of papers but had other effects as well. So yellow journalism is just when newspapers would write articles or stories that maybe weren't entirely the truth, or they were extremely exaggerated, and they did this just to sell papers. So basically they were at times lying in order to sell a newspaper. It whipped up American public opinion in favor of the Cuban rebels. So it kind of worked in this sense because it convinced Americans to support the Cuban rebels because these articles were in their favor. It led to a burst of national pride and desire for an aggressive foreign policy, which became known as jingoism. We don't want to fight, yet by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we got the money too. So again, because of yellow journalism, Americans decided to support Cuba. A jingo in this case is just an extreme fighting nationalist. I also want to note that the Spanish were being very cruel. They were putting Cuban civilians into guarded camps in miserable conditions with little food or sanitation. They were doing this because they were afraid they were aiding the rebels. And over 2 years, disease and starvation ended up killing 200,000 Cubans. Now, Cuban exiles, or people who left Cuba, asked for the United States to get involved. But both President McKinley and Cleveland refused. So frustrated Cuban guerrillas turned to one tactic they knew would attract the U.S. government's attention: the destruction of American sugar plantations and mills in Cuba. As a result, business owners increased their pressure on the government to act, and essentially that's why we finally do get involved in the Cuban rebellion against Spain, because we are concerned with our business interests in the area. All right, remember the Maine. So February 15th, 1898, USS Maine battleship blew up in Havana harbor. Americans blamed the Spanish. So basically one of our ships blows up near Cuba. The Spanish are trying to overtake the country. The Cubans are rebelling. And so the ship blows up. So we first go, our first thought there is to blame the Spanish. Newspapers called for war in retaliation. Pressure from the American public equaled pro-war. April 11th, 1898, McKinley's War message to Congress. May 1st, 1898, U.S. attacked Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, Philippines. Now, it's important that you understand that there's a lot of controversy about the explosion of USS Maine battleship. We will be doing a lesson on this event specifically. However, it is rumored that, and many historians believe this, that it actually was not the Spanish that blew up this ship, that it was actually just an issue within the ship. So McKinley tried to make peace with Spain before going to war. He sent a list of requests to Spain. First, he wanted compensation for Maine. He, 2, wanted to end the Reconstruction camps. 3, a truce for Cuba, or in Cuba. And then 4, Cuban independence. Spain agreed to all of these, except for number 4, Cuban independence. He would not agree to this. Steps to war. The USS Maine was stationed in Havana Harbor. Spanish Ambassador Delome insulted President McKinley. The USS Maine exploded and the American public blamed Spain. Congress recognized Cuban independence and authorized force against Spain. A splendid little war. May 1st, 1898, the United States launched a surprise attack in Manila Bay and destroyed Spain's entire Pacific fleet in 7 hours. July 1st, Roosevelt led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, and July 3rd, the United States Navy sank the remaining Spanish ships. As far as the Delome letter, the United States newspapers published a letter stolen from the Spanish ambassador to Washington. The letter described McKinley as a weak and bitter for the admiration of the crowd. This caused an outcry in the U.S. And this is how the Spanish ambassador insulted President McKinley. For Splendid Little War, future Secretary of the State John Hay wrote Teddy Roosevelt and said this: only 400 men had died in battle. However, 2,500 had died in the war because of food poisoning, yellow fever, malaria, and inadequate medical care. War lasted only 4 months. Treaty of Paris signed with Spain in December 1898. The Spanish government recognized Cuba's independence. Spain gave up Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico in return for $20 million. And the island nations then became unincorporated territories of the United States. Spanish-American War, 1898. This image here just shows some of the routes that were taken by U.S. forces in blue here from Florida. It shows San Juan Hill, where one of the battles took place. And then it also shows some of the routes of the Spanish forces here in red. Again, this only lasted 4 months long. And again, the major events of this war, kind of start us off with the sinking of the Maine. Then the Spanish fleet is destroyed in Manila. Rough Riders charge up San Juan Hill. And then by July 3rd, U.S. Navy sank every Spanish ship. All right, so new challenges after the war. The Philippines, President McKinley's arguments for annexation. Filipinos were unfit for self-government. Independence would bring anarchy or no government. European powers would try to seize the islands. The Filipinos fought a 3-year war for independence, and the Philippines did not gain complete independence until 1946. Cuba President McKinley installed a military government to protect American business interests. Cuba drafted a constitution in 1900 that did not allow for U.S. involvement. The U.S. government only agreed to remove its troops if Cuba included the Platt Amendment, and the Platt Amendment remained in place until 1934, and it allowed for U.S. naval bases on the island and intervention whenever necessary. Again, with the Treaty of Paris, Spain gave up the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico in return for $20 million. And also, as far as the Platt Amendment goes, Cuba could also not enter into any foreign agreements. Other gains in the Pacific, Hawaii. The United States government intervened in other parts of the Pacific at the same time that events played out in the Spanish-American War. This intervention eventually brought about changes in the relationships of the United States with Hawaii, Samoa, and China. Hawaii became increasingly important to the United States business interests. Hawaii also leased Pearl Harbor to the United States as a fueling and repair station for naval vessels. And in 1898, Congress approved the annexation of Hawaii. Other gains in the Pacific, Polynesia and Samoa. The Polynesian islands of Samoa and their harbor at Ponopono were also important to the United States. A year after the annexation of Hawaii, the United States acquired the harbor of Ponopono as well. Other gains were Guam Island, Wake Island, and Palmyra Island. So why is this important? Well, it was stepping stones to the growing trade in Asia. Other gains in the Pacific, China. China's huge population and its vast markets became very important to American trade. President McKinley's Secretary of State John Hay wrote notes to the major European powers trying to persuade them to keep an open door to China. He wanted to ensure through this open door policy that the United States would have equal access to China's millions of consumers. Russia, Germany, France, Britain, and Japan all had interest in China as well. And again, the open door policy just means open trade with China. The U.S. was an emerging world power. The Spanish-American War vaulted the United States onto the world stage. Over the coming years, the United States would embrace several new approaches to foreign policy.